This hat hair is just horrible. Okay. Do you want some of that? Do you want some of that tea? You can't have it. Okay. I have my tea. I have a cat. And it is currently snowing outside. We are expecting 6 to 7 inches today. I don't know if you can see out the window, but it is really coming down out there. I just got back from work and it took about twice as long as usual, which I'm glad that everyone's taking their time and being careful on the roads. We don't want anyone to be getting into any accidents, but I really just wanted to be home. But anyway, we're here, so let's do a BookTube Newbie Tag video. My name's RG. I'm a writer, a reader, and a lover of all things written word adjacent. I have posted 2 or 3 videos for BookTube before, so I did a December wrap-up, a January wrap-up, and somewhere in there I also did a little free library raid. So this isn't the first video that I'm recording for BookTube, but it is the first one where we're talking more about me than about the books that I've been reading. As always, I have timestamps in the description for the video, and that'll include all of the BookTube Newbie Tag questions so you can kind of sift through and find whatever's more interesting for you. And I also added a couple of questions of my own at the end because if you've seen videos for the BookTube Newbie Tag before, you know that they are, they're good. They're great for an introduction, but they're also just a little tiny bit stuffy, maybe more about the channel than about the reading. So I've got them on my iPad in front of me. Let's go through them one at a time and see, what we have to say. Okay, so first question is, why did you start this channel? That's a good one. So last year, I was pretty sick. I was pretty ill, and for a while there in October, November, I was a little bit depressed, and I was having a hard time finding things that I enjoyed or that I could engage in and find meaning in. And so one of the things that I was able to enjoy was watching BookTube content and listening to people talk about the books that they're reading and loving, and then finding some inspiration to get back into reading and enjoy a little escapism of my own. So I guess you could say that starting this channel is a little bit paying it forward and a little bit, personal self-indulgence. I really love books. I love talking about them. So it's nice to have an avenue to talk about actual novels that are out there, or not just novels, but books in general. Question number 2, what do I bring to YouTube? You know how they say that there's nothing original under the sun? It feels like there's no original answer to this question under the sun. So maybe to answer, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. I am Spanish-English bilingual. I also speak Japanese fluently, and I'm currently studying Korean. I grew up all over North and South America, as well as spending a couple years in Japan, so I have a multicultural, multilinguistic background. I've also studied linguistics as well as communicative disorders. On top of that, I'm a pretty broad reader. I read both fiction and nonfiction. I enjoy poetry, and when it comes to fiction genres, I will read pretty much anything. It might take me a little while to get to something outside what I normally read, but I do read very diversely from every genre. And on top of loving to read, I'm also a writer. So when I read, I also tend to look at the craft and construction of the stories and the writing, and that's just my own personal interest. I'm not sure what that says that I'll be able to bring to BookTube that's original or different from what anyone else can offer, but that's just who I am and the point of view that I'm coming from. What are you most excited about for this new channel? So like I said, I've done a few videos so far, and I will say the thing that I'm the most excited about is interacting with people in the comments and seeing what they think about the books that I've read, if they've read them, or if they have any recommendations based on the things that I talk about. It's nice to have algorithms that will tell you, hey, if you liked this book, maybe you'll enjoy this one, but there's really nothing that beats a personal recommendation from someone whose taste that you trust. I do think that there have been a couple of really great recommendations, and I'm really excited to dig into those. I guess the opportunity to start a dialogue about different stories is really what I've been looking forward to the most. Okay. Why do you love reading? Again, I don't think that this is necessarily an original answer, but there is something so beautiful. Okay, you know what, actually? I do have an answer for this one that might be original. Have you ever seen the movie Waking Life? back when I was dating, I used to use it as a screener film. If I saw someone for a few dates in a row, I'd show them the movie Waking Life, and if they didn't have anything intelligent to say about it, so it's been a long time since I've seen this movie. But basically what happens at the beginning of this movie is that this guy gets out of a cab and he's crossing the street and he sees this Post-it note on the ground and it says to look up. He looks up and then a car is coming straight at him. And then the rest of the film is sort of this like weird little acid trip sort of situation where he goes through all these different conversations with philosophers and scientists and all kinds of people with different perspectives about life and things like that. And then he, there's a question about whether or not it's a waking life or whether he's dreaming or whether he's dead, Okay, but leaving all of that aside, the reason why I love reading. So in this movie, there's this scene, and I'm pretty sure that someone uploaded the scene onto YouTube like a few years ago, so I'll see if I can find it and then put it in the description below in case you want to watch it. But in the scene in the video, and sorry to be completely disjointed with my train of thought here, but this is also the reason why I started studying linguistics in the first place. But the scene in this movie is there's this woman who's talking, and she's talking about when we are communicating with words, words are inert. They're not alive, right? We hear information, we process it, and then we compare it to the information that we have in our own minds. So for example, if someone, and I'm quoting the scene here, if someone were to say like, tiger right behind you, we had a way to communicate that, and that's a very concrete thing. But when we get into more abstract words, things like love or family or sorrow, right? Those are words that are highly nuanced and contextual, and there's no concrete definition for what they are. So the fact that we're able to communicate at a high level with people and understand one another or feel that we understand one another, even if, there's always opportunities for miscommunication because, my definition of love might be different from your definition of love. And if I were to say, I love you, and you don't have a good experience with love, maybe that doesn't mean the same thing to you, right? So there's always opportunities for miscommunication, but regardless, the fact that we're able to communicate at such a high level and communicate such complex thoughts and ideas and our innermost states and all of that through words is really miraculous if you think about it. And the fact that we can do that with words that are written on a page, not even words that we hear where we have like a vocal inflection that we can take meaning from, but words that are written down and we're still able to conjure in our mind's eye this completely separate world from our current reality, right? With people that we've never met who are doing things that we could never imagine. And we're able to picture that perfectly in our minds, our own version of it, maybe not the author's version, but our own version of it. I think that's participating in something truly miraculous, and that's something that, no other species I don't think has. It's really incredible. That's why I love reading. Oh, I'm getting a little choked up. I just find it incredible that we're able to escape from our current realities into reality that exists only in our own imaginations, and that's something that was given to us by somebody else at a different time, in a different place, just through words on a page. Like, that is so cool. What book or series got you into reading? Okay. I'm actually going to combine this with the answer for the next question, which is, when did you start reading? Because the answer is the same. And there's two answers because one's a book and one's a series. So the book that first got me into reading, I would say, was in about third grade. My teacher would do like a chapter of a book every single day, and she would read them aloud to us. And the book that she was reading at the time was, I think it was called like The Great Escape or The Great Escapist or The Great Cat Escape or something like that. It was about these cats, two of them, and they went out on adventures, and I just thought it was the most fun thing. I thought it was really cool. I just really loved the idea of this fantasy story about these cats going off to do things. So I would go over to my neighbor's house and we would play and we would write stories together. And we started off with I wouldn't call it a fan fiction of, but definitely an homage to The Great Escape, or whatever the title of this book was. And then the series that got me into reading was actually a little bit further down the line. So I loved the oral reading that my teacher was doing in third grade, but personally as a reader, I had a really, really hard time. I was learning to read in English when I barely spoke English. I was primarily Spanish speaking at the time. And so I had a lot of challenges with that. It took me a long time to feel comfortable reading and then to make it a part of my identity. And I think the first book series that did that for me was the Redwall books. I don't know if you remember those. You can't really find them in stores anymore. I know you can still order them, but they're not really on the shelves next to the Percy Jacksons and the Hogwarts and all that stuff. So they're these books that are basically like medieval fantasy setting featuring animals instead of people. And there's, badgers and mice, and all the stories are stories about overcoming adversity or forging friendships. And also I remember that the author, Brian Jacques, I believe his name was, the author had these absolutely scrumptious, unbelievable descriptions of food in the stories. And I also love food, go figure. So it was really aligned with all of my interests. Okay, where do you read? Where don't I read? I read everywhere. I read here, I read over there, I read in bed, I read on the metro, I read in the car, I read everywhere. I don't read while I'm driving. Well, unless I'm listening to an audiobook. In general, I prefer to read books on paper. I'll read comics or fan fiction on my phone, but generally speaking, I prefer to read on paper. And in general, I would say I'm more of a nighttime reader than a morning reader. I am one of those people who will definitely stay up forever to read a book. What kind of books do you like to read? I think I answered this already. In general, I think my favorite genres are horror, magic realism, fantasy, and romance. I do read pretty much every genre though. The only genre that I don't think that I've read anything of is Westerns, although I have read some Western romances, but not like a traditional Western. So maybe that's something that I should try to check off. I love literary. I love genre. I just love a good story. So if it's good, I'll read it. What does your book collection look like? Well, so a lot of booktubers will have this like wall of bookcases behind them, or they'll have, their books sorted by color, or they'll have the little labels to make it look like a library. Just really, really, really awesome setups. I live in a townhouse. It's an older townhouse. It's not really that space efficient, so I wasn't able to set up a home library or like a reading nook or anything like that. But I do have my books all over the house, which is kind of nice in its own way. I think having books around always makes a room look a little bit cozier, so it's nice to have books everywhere. Here's one bookcase. The one right behind me is like DVDs and Blu-ray, and that's important to have physical media now that streaming services are getting rid of things. But this is our comics bookcase. Over there, I've got two other bookcases, which are sort of the family's books. So it's, a lot of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. And then in my office, I have two bookcases, which are my personal books, my favorites, reference books for work, crafting books, things that I like keeping close to hand. And then my spouse has their own whole bookcase collection upstairs in their office. So I'll include a little clip and show you all my different bookcases and all their contents so that you can judge for yourself. Prefacing this to say that I have not organized these bookcases for this video at all. So this is our comic book bookshelf. We've got some Stephen King comics, monsters, an illuminated copy of the Fairy Tales of Oscar Wilde, The Joker, Appleseed, Battle Angel Alita, Dr. Slump, Dragon Ball, 3x3 Eyes. This is Dungeon Meshi, Delicious in Dungeon, Scott Pilgrim, Akira, Rick and Morty Invincible, and then a bunch of coffee table books. Okay, so here we've got the general fiction, nonfiction corner. So here's sci-fi fantasy, that's The Expanse. We've got some travel books, American Psycho, independently published fiction, classics, foreign books, the book that I made, some Robert Reardon, Dragonlance, games, strategy guides, things like that. Then here we've got more Stephen King, Elf Quest, some role-playing game stuff, Lord of the Rings, Wuthering Heights, etc., etc. And then here's the just general fantasy, including David Eddings, some Pierce Anthony, and George R.R. Martin. All right, and here's in my office. So we've got a bunch of old journals and stuff back there. BTS, some of the books from my Little Free Library raid, Little Free Library stuff, fiction, nonfiction. Here's Redemption of Alphalus. You can see my copy is pretty beat up. And there's the copy of Misery that I've been meaning to read forever. Here's some comics. These are all Japanese manga. They're back there. And then here's kind of where I have the fiction. So these are a lot of horror and fantasy, magic, realism titles. Chanel Miller's Know My Name was absolutely stunning. I'm not a huge memoir reader, but wow, like, wow. Here we've got some nonfiction books, Entangled Life, Mycotopia, books about apothecaries, a lot of bird books. I am a birder. Cultish, horror books, writing books, Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen related stuff, Oscar Wilde. And then the bottom down here is all Japanese language stuff from back when I was a student, and then speech therapy stuff for now. The little Pikmin stuffed animals. Spouse is not a big fan of giving flowers because they die. So the first year we were dating for Valentine's Day, my gift in lieu of flowers was a video game flower. This little guy. And so every year for Valentine's Day since, I have received video game flowers as a gift. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So this is our 8th year together. If I ever forget, I just count the flowers. And that's the end of the BookTube Newbie Tag questions as written. But I thought I might ask and answer a couple more questions just to give you a little bit more information about my own personal reading preferences and tastes and things like that. So these are the 3 other questions that I'm going to be answering. What's a book that you've loved in each of your favorite genres? What's a book that you've read and reread more than once? And what's a book that you've been putting off reading for a while that you really need to get to? So a book that I've read and loved in each of my favorite genres. So we'll go through them one by one. Magic realism. So when I was young, maybe like 10 or 11, I read The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende, and I read it in the original Spanish. And this was a real challenge for me at the time because although I am Spanish native language speaking, when I was little, I went through a long period of rejecting Spanish. And this will happen a lot when you have, a child who grows up speaking a language which is not the dominant language of the culture around them. They'll tend to reject that mother tongue in favor of learning to speak the language of the people in their peer group, right? So English in my case. But after many years of only speaking short sentences to my mom and dad in Spanish and generally avoiding speaking it as much as possible, I really came to realize how much I valued that part of my identity and how disconnected I had felt from it. I started reading it in the original Spanish, and it really helped that Isabel Allende is actually a Chilean author, and I'm Chilean, so our dialects of Spanish are the same. The level of language was way too high for me, and I don't think I understood the majority of what I was reading at the time. The funny thing about reading is that often what stays in your memory isn't necessarily the story or the character names or the character arcs, but the impression that the book left on you, how you felt while you were reading it. I haven't read this book in a very, very, very long time, so I don't remember it pretty much at all, except that I really, really loved it. I remember I loved the mood. I remember I loved the ambiance of the story. I do want to reread it at some point so that I can refresh my memory. That way I can say that I currently love it as well as having loved it in the past. Horror. I would say the first horror book that I read that really made me fall in love with the genre was Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. It's a classic for a reason. I was absolutely floored by the beauty of the prose, the naturalness of the dialogue, how entertaining the characters were at the beginning, and then that creeping sense of dread, the expert manipulation of the reader to increase your anxiety. There were a couple of parts in the book where I had to set the book down and just kind of give myself a moment to breathe. I think that Shirley Jackson just had this really incredible way of making you feel just as out of place and as excluded as Eleanor, the protagonist of the story. And then the ending was really just a gut punch, absolutely fantastic read. One of my first 5-star reads after I started keeping track of book ratings. And 100% the reason I fell in love with the genre. Okay, romance. So I am a huge Jane Austen girly, but I will spare you the Pride and Prejudice recommendation and recommend Venetia by Georgette Heyer instead. Now, I want to preface this by saying that Georgette Heyer is a little bit of a controversial figure. She had some anti-Semitic and racist viewpoints, which were typical of people in her cultural group at the time that she was writing, which was in the 1920s, 30s. So I'm not saying that she is infallible and that just because I like her books, that she was not a controversial figure, right? I think that there is always room for nuance in these kinds of discussions, as long as I'm not putting money into her pockets, which I'm not because she's dead. There's nothing wrong with me saying I enjoy the book while also acknowledging she was problematic. So, that said, Venetia is a historical romance that was written in, I think, like the late 20s or right around there. Venetia is the story of a young woman who grew up on sort of a long leash. She has a brother who has a chronic leg injury, and that has impacted his mobility throughout his life. And although her life is fairly lonely and small town, she grew up as the daughter of the landed gentry, so she's pretty well to do. One day, a new neighbor moves in next door, and this is a young man who's famous for throwing routs and orgies and all kinds of parties and being an absolute roustabout, a rake. Not the kind of guy that you want to bring home to meet your mom for supper. The story's great. There's a lot of romantic tension. There's a little bit of a love triangle, although we all know who she's going to end up with. It's never a question. The writing is absolutely delightful. There's a lot of references to literature and philosophy. It's beautiful. Worth reading, again, acknowledging that Georgette Heyer is maybe not the most upstanding sort of person that we would want to emulate. Okay, fantasy. So I'm actually going to combine the answer for fantasy with the answer for the next question, which is, what's a book that you've read and reread more than once? That book would be The Redemption of Alphalus by David and Leigh Eddings. And it's funny to me that for a book that I am saying that I particularly enjoyed, it doesn't have a great rating on Goodreads. It's like 3.8 stars or something like that. This is a standalone fantasy novel. It was published in 2000. The main character, Alphalus, is a thief, and he is renowned for his incredible luck. The problem is that he has a run of really, really, really awful bad luck at the beginning of the book. And thinking that his goddess of luck has abandoned him, he is in dire straits, and he accepts a job from a really creepy, scary guy called Gend to go to the house of the end of the world and collect the white book and bring it back to him. Alphalus can't read. He's never seen a book before. He doesn't know what's up, but he's got to do it for the money because he really can't afford not to right now. So he goes to the house of the end of the world, and there he meets Dwea. Anyway, it is an absolutely enjoyable read, and I will say, for a book that was published in 2000, it's actually held up pretty well. It's not perfect, but it does have a ton of really fun and interesting fantasy concepts. It goes through time travel, magic, fate, predetermined fate, gods and goddesses, the end of the world, undoing creation. It tackles social issues like gender discrimination, misogyny, religion and blind faith, for example. And there's a romance in it, as well as a few side romances, and that's really lovely to read too. It's a standalone, it's a big chonky boy, but it is a good book to read. I'd recommend picking it up and trying it. Maybe you don't like it, maybe you're one of the 3.8 star givers on Goodreads, but I enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed it more than once. And the last question is, what's a book that you've been putting off reading for a while that you really need to get to? The book that I've been waiting to read for a long time and have been planning on reading it, and it's on my TBR forever, and I just have not gotten around to it, would be Stephen King's Misery. I've read some King. I love horror as a genre, but I confess that I have not been a huge reader of Stephen King's works. I think I've read Bag of Bones and It, and I think that's all. But I know Misery is supposed to be really, really good. I have been wanting to read it for a long time. I know that it's about a writer. I don't know. I just have a thing about Stephen King's writing. He's a good writer, but it takes me a while to get into the mind frame where I want to read his writing. You know what it's like? It's like going to a party as an introvert, okay? You really don't want to leave your house. You don't want to go. Your friend is pulling you along, trying to get you to follow, and you just resist and resist and resist. But once you get there, you have a pretty good time, right? That's how it is with me and Stephen King's books. So, Misery, it's on the list. Will I get to it this year? I don't know. I'm not sure. We'll see. There's also a bunch of like romantasy or fantasy books like Brando Sando's books that I've been planning to get to at some point, but I just have not yet. So that's it for my BookTube Newbie Tag video today. Thank you so much for keeping me company while I gush about the books that I love. I'd love to know if you've read any of the books that I've talked about today, or if you are a reader of the kinds of genres that I've listed off. If you have a favorite from each of those genres, I'd love to hear what those are. Hopefully I'll see you in the comments below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. I'll be around. The next video that I've got coming out is about writing, but more BookTube stuff is pending. Thanks so much. Bye. Okay, in the time that I spent recording that video, look at this. It's so bad out there. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's terrible.